This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. There isn't a relationship anywhere in the world that is both more complicated and more simple than that of the Russia-China relationship. As from the outside, these two should be best friends. One has lots of established industry, whilst the other has cheap labor. One has a whole bunch of energy resources, whilst the other is the largest consumer of these resources. And both would like to see the US and the EU probably taking down a couple of pegs. In fact, they even share a lot of history. From a surface glance, these two should be best friends, and yet behind closed doors, the two of them regularly and actively work to undermine each other. And again, this is actually nothing new, with these sorts of events going on for centuries now. But if you're looking for one clear example of this, I want to take you back to 1958, a period when Khrushchev had taken power in the Soviet Union after Stalin, Mao had just forced the Americans to a standstill in Korea, and had effectively secured his control over the People's Republic of China. Both men were ascendant with power, and in 1958, the two would meet up together to discuss how these two communist superpowers could work together to undermine the position of the West. As part of this 1958 meeting, Khrushchev would fly to Beijing, the talk centering around nuclear weapons and proliferation, and the two leaders beginning negotiations on the possibility of a joint Russia-China naval fleet here in the Pacific. But when Mao asked to be cut into the nuclear propulsion program the Soviets were putting together for their submarines, Russia would push back, asking a higher price of China and demanding to be able to build Soviet radio stations on Chinese territory. In response, China would refuse the deal, demanding now that any proposed joint fleet should be run under the command of China. Another classic breakdown between the leaders of Moscow and Beijing. But Khrushchev didn't want to head back to Moscow without a win, so was willing to compromise and keep a dialogue going the next day. Chairman Mao, though, wanted none of it, and would instead go out of his way to try and humiliate Khrushchev, as after learning that Khrushchev, a boy from the middle of Russia, could not swim, Mao would book their next day's meeting inside one of the palace's swimming pools. Khrushchev was not told beforehand, and upon entering the courtyard, find Mao sitting there in his bathing suit. Khrushchev was furious with Mao for this move, but also wanted to keep the dialogue going, and so was forced to strip down to his satin boxers, have arm floaties attached to his arms, and be lowered into the swimming pool by his bodyguards, attempting to try and negotiate with Mao whilst tackling one of his biggest fears. All whilst Mao continued to swim laps around him mockingly. Khrushchev would eventually get out of the pool and walk away from the summit effectively empty-handed. And whilst the two of them probably could have teamed up and really dealt some damage to the Western Bloc at that point, petty rivalries and egos had won out the day. And this dynamic between Khrushchev and Mao is not unique to leaders of Beijing and Moscow, with the leaders of these two countries consistently bickering across the Cold War, even entering into a full shooting conflict as recently as 1969. But all of that was during the Cold War, and many of you would probably assume that things have probably changed since then. After all, Putin and Xi have already announced their no-limits friendship. Surely that's a sign that all of this is in the past, right? But behind the scenes, the relationship is still incredibly complicated, particularly now as Moscow is nowhere near an economic equal to China anymore, as the balance of power continues to favor one side, and a war-weakened Russia is once again being forced to come meet China by the swimming pool. So what is the state of the Russia-China relationship? Will these two be able to actually put their past aside and properly tackle the outside threats towards them? And now with Ukraine thrown into the mix, how is China looking to use that conflict to its own advantage? Those are just some of the questions we're going to be tackling here today. And to help us understand the dynamics currently taking place within Russia that pushed Moscow into the position it finds itself, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Bearing the cost.
China has the luxury of sitting back and watching who comes out on top of this conflict. It's, of course, quite gratifying if you're watching from Beijing and your two major rivals are slugging it out between them, because to the extent that this war is calling on the combined military resources of the West, but also exhausting Russia, that's got to be big good news for China both ways.
Keir Giles is a senior consulting fellow for the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. In addition to that, he's also previously led the Conflict Studies Research Centre and was a senior member of the BBC's monitoring service. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
But of course, there are downsides as well. So China's tolerance for some of Russia's antics will be fairly limited. We've seen some dissatisfaction at the economic fallout, and of course, Russia's reckless nuclear threats have had a slap on the wrist from Beijing from time to time. So it's a question of how much China is actually willing to weaken both of its adversaries at the same time.
So between these two countries, we've seen a variety of positions, from allies to rivals, to China price gouging the Russians during the 1990s, and Russia price gouging the Chinese during the 2010s. And now with a no-limits friendship that isn't an alliance put into the mix, can you sum up how this relationship has changed over the last few years?
The different ways in which the relationship have been described tend to boil down to a number of different catchphrases, and I think all of them tend to be a little bit misleading. There's a lot of conversation about whether this is an alliance or a marriage of convenience or just a kind of alignment of interests. And into that pot, there's been this no limits phraseology thrown in as well, which I think just makes it more confusing. I think it's far more useful to actually judge by what China is doing and what Russia is putting up with than actually using the labels to describe what's going on. And in that respect, we've seen the support for Russia being tempered in some respects, but also quite a significant enabler for Russia in others. So the supplies, for example, to Russia's defense industry are a major enabler for Russia continuing its campaigns against Ukraine. But on the other hand, the political support, although it's not actually directly constraining Russia and it's not criticizing or condemning Russia, is not as overt as it would be if you take this no limits friendship actually at face value and think that China is going to interpret it literally. I think it's worth looking at it over the longer period as well, because if you look at the overall history of Russia trying to sell things to China as well as buy things from China, it's often been a bit of a wary relationship. Russia's early arms sales after, for example, were very rapidly reverse engineered by China in much the same way as they copied Western technology, which made Russian manufacturers quite leery of selling. But the biggest change that we've seen is in the way in which Russia becomes more and more dependent on China, particularly in the context of Western sanctions, which are designed to constrain its modernization of its defense industry and the production of munitions. So that gives China a certain amount of leverage on Russia.
Well, you mentioned arms sales there, so let's go a little bit deeper with that one, as these two countries have always had a pretty interesting trend around arms sales. Now, if we look back in history, we can see that between 1991 and 2005, Russia at that period was pretty willing to sell just about anything that wasn't bolted down at the time. And so the Chinese actually bought a fair amount of military equipment from the Russians during that period, all of which was purchased at a pretty heavy discount. Then between 2005 and 2014, things went a bit quiet between the two, until 2014 when Russia carried out its invasion of Crimea. At that point, the first sanctions were then applied to Russia, and the Russian economy needed a cash boost. At which time, the Chinese were more than happy to step in, buying up a whole bunch of Russian surplus military equipment, of course, at a discount price. But then after a short while, things died back down, and arms sales remained quite low between the two. And then now, if you move forward to 2022, and Russia carries out its invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people started looking to China again to see if they would carry out another shopping spree within the Russian bunkers, now that Moscow needed cash again. Yet when it comes to military equipment, they really didn't. To which arms sales between China and Russia remained fairly low, if not almost non-existent. In fact, right now, China seems more keen to try and sell its own equipment into the countries that are currently having trouble receiving their own supply of Russian weapons. So for someone who's followed Russia for so long, why do we see this difference in arms sales between the last time Russia needed the cash in 2014 and the next time the Russians needed the cash in 2022?
I think it's a little surprising that we haven't seen much of a campaign on that scale taking effect in world arms markets yet. Now, of course, there are two reasons why Russian arms trade has effectively collapsed. First of all, they want to keep all the weapons for themselves because they're burning through them at such a prodigious rate. But also, the allure of Russian arms and the reputation that they had has been comprehensively torpedoed by their performance in Ukraine. Now, in that respect, the fact that there is such a commonality in terms of the design roots between Russian and Chinese technology isn't going to play in China's favor. But there are certainly markets now into which China could step if it felt the need.
So China has made a big song and dance about not supplying Russia for its war in Ukraine, largely in an effort to avoid incurring sanctions themselves. But experts keep showing that China, whilst not supplying direct arms, have been supplying a lot of dual-use materials to the Russians. So can you take us through what they are supplying to the Russian war effort and why they'd choose to supply Russia in this fashion?
That is precisely it. Not weapons, but the things to make weapons. All of the different technologies that Russia would previously have sourced from the West now have to come through other routes, whether it is a Chinese equivalent or whether it's, for example, microprocessors used for precision-guided weapons, which have to be routed through third countries in order to evade the sanctions regime. It's both the technology and, of course, the components for actual weapons, right down to the basics, like, for example, nitrocellulose for making explosives. All of this now is something which is in demand on global markets, because let's not forget, it's not just Russia, but it's also Western countries backing Ukraine that are shopping around for not only the weapon systems, but also the components for making them. But Russia, for the time being, appears to have a reliable supplier in the form of China.
How do you think the war in Ukraine has impacted the relationship between these two? And how have you seen the public perception of the relationship between these two change over that time?
I think it came as a surprise to a lot of people when it was revealed just how much China had been supporting the Russian war economy. I think there'd been an assumption, possibly not a very well-founded one, that because the West had imposed sanctions that were supposed to constrain Russia's technological development and constrain the building of precision weapons, then that somehow dampened Russia's ability to import across the board. And the fact that the imports from China have stepped up to such a massive extent, I think came as an unpleasant surprise. And of course, explains a great deal about how Russia is able to continue to produce missiles and so on in a period when they were supposed to be facing significant difficulties as a result of sanctions. Of course, it is not just China. It is also Western exports that are being redirected through third countries, because sanctions are only as good as their enforcement. But still, the way China has stepped up and is supporting Russia in this way is a major problem. China as well, because of this position they're in at the moment, of being able to sit back and see how this plays out, and then pick up the pieces afterwards and adjust their relationships and their posture depending on who comes out stronger at the end of this process.
So what if these two decided they wanted to take things a bit further, and China came to Russia with a proposal for something like a Beijing-led Warsaw Pact alliance? Do you think Russia would be ever willing to enter into an alliance with China like that?
When you're thinking about Russia and alliances, it's one of the areas where you bump very rapidly into Russian national neuroses and the idea that as a great power, Russia is not supposed to be reliant on anybody. And of course, it's part of the very definition of Russian statehood. They think that Russia is the major power. It's the great power. It's one of the big powers in the world, which doesn't need to rely on anybody, is in sharp conflict, of course, with the fact that they are now dependent on China in so many ways. But it's another of the ways in which Russia cannot publicly admit what this relationship now is. Not only because, of course, it undermines this whole idea of Russian statehood. Now, that argues against any kind of formal, explicit, overt kind of alliance of a NATO type between Russia and China. But of course, there have been other initiatives as well, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like the ways in which Russia and China have been cooperating without going as far as an actual formal alliance.
So what I've always found interesting between these two is the outside analysis of the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. So, for example, if you go back to the old US nuclear war plans, it seems that the plan was that the US would look to eliminate most of China as well within that first strike, under the justification that China and Moscow are both communist and they're probably allied together. Yet, when reading the Russian documentation around Chinese strategy, it really doesn't feel that same way from the Russian perspective, with, in fact, most of the Russian documents actually posing huge suspicions coming from China, with significant concerns that if Moscow and Washington were to enter into a conflict, that China might move to take advantage of the situation and invade Russia's Far East. If that is the kind of relationship these guys were having during the height of the Cold War, when it was the Western world versus the communist world, do you think we'll ever see Russia and China ever truly trusting each other? Even to the level of, let's say, the way the US and UK tend to trust each other on most things?
I don't think there's ever really going to be a situation where Russia fully trusts. If you look at Russia's strategic documentation, there's always been a pretense that China doesn't really exist, because you're not allowed to mention that there might be any potential problems with China. Unlike NATO, which you can beat with a rhetorical stick all day long, the moment you start complaining about China or suggesting that there might be difficulties in the relationship, that causes diplomatic and political and economic pain that Russia doesn't want to suffer.
And it's not like they don't give each other a bunch of reasons to not trust each other. I know one of the stories that pops up every few years between Russia and China is surrounding some of Beijing's claims to Russian territory in the Far East. You see, even despite the fact that Moscow and Beijing had signed a treaty back in 2005, that should have resolved all of their various border disputes. That latest border deal merely confirmed the lines set by the previous 1858 to 1860 treaties, where, depending on who you want to ask, there was no mention of the enormous territory north of Heilongjiang, the province in China in the far northeast, formerly known as Manchuria, as this area that is now part of Russia was formerly a part of the Qing Empire. Now, while most of this should have been probably relegated to pub trivia nights, it does actually occasionally come up in the politics between Russia and Moscow. In fact, coming up as recently as February 2023, when the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources issued a decree on the use of names on international maps, where some cities in Russia would now have to be referred to by their Chinese names, with 8 Russian place names in particular certainly raising some eyebrows in Moscow, as those cities include locations like Vladivostok, the largest city in the Russian Far East and home of the Russian Pacific Fleet, as well as Khabarovsk, the headquarters of the Russian ground forces for the Eastern Military District, all of which, according to this decree, should now be referred to by their Chinese names. And all of this can get even more complicated again, as if I were to look at this photograph I have here in front of me, I can see a member of the Chinese consulate staff in Vladivostok standing in front of some older Chinese maps, with these maps being from when the territory is part of the Qing Empire in 1689. Now, again, I do think a lot of this gets overblown, and that it's probably more likely the case of an overzealous consulate staffer, or simply just China trying to rattle some cages and see what happens. But why would China keep prodding Russia in this area? What do they hope to gain from that?
I think this will intensify. I think we'll see more and more of this over time, because China has the luxury of being able to sit back and wait while Russia exhausts itself fighting in Ukraine. Now, what that means is that China is able to simply sit back and choose its moment. And we may or may not be able to see in advance when that choice has been made. But these little hints that are dropped in by China about the fact that they still have an eye on those former territories which were taken over by Russia. And of course, there's not a great deal that Russia can actually do about it because of the fragility of this relationship and the imbalance of this relationship. There's not anything that they're going to be protesting about loudly when they are so dependent on China. So China can simply sit back and pick its moment because all of the trends in the relationship are against Russia.
Okay, let's say for the sake of the argument, China does have ambitions to take this further than just old mining maps. If they did decide to launch an invasion into the Russian Far East, does Russia actually have enough firepower stationed out here in the area to be able to push them back like they have in the past?
Well, Russia does have assets, most prominently, of course, in the form of tactical nuclear weapons, which in the Russian approach to how you deter adversaries have always been the more prominent in conversations about what to do about the threat from China than they have with the West. Because of the vast areas involved and because of the relatively small numbers of Russian troops that there were actually available to cover these vast areas, the joke that used to be made when Russia was faced with this problem was that the challenge for the Chinese military when they came across the border wouldn't actually be defeating the Russian army, it would actually be finding it in the first place because there was so little of it. So Russia is reliant on other means of deterring China and keeping China out than simply having a strong conventional military presence there.
If China did successfully occupy some of Russia's major cities out here, and Moscow didn't have the readily available forces in order to dislodge them conventionally, do you think we would see the Russians use nuclear weapons in order to push the Chinese out of the territory?
Just a couple of months ago, we had a supposed leak of exercise scenarios reported in Western media looking at exercises against China, in which the move to releasing tactical nuclear weapons was fairly early on. Now, that got misinterpreted in a lot of Western media as an indication that Russia had actually lowered its threshold criteria for using nuclear weapons against the West as well, which overlooked a couple of key points. First of all, it was a scenario that was a decade plus old, so it was a very different situation than we have today. And secondly, of course, the criteria for use in scenarios with China is very, very different from what you've got in the West. So it wasn't actually a lowering of the requirements for nuclear use, a change in the threshold. It was actually a confirmation of what people had observed previously. But it does highlight this role of an early move to a nuclear deterrent because Russia doesn't have much else to keep China out.
Okay, what if we go the other way? And Russia occupies a small part of Chinese territory, likely near the tri-point between Russia, Mongolia, and China. Or, for the sake of the argument, China pulls a Vladimir Putin and backs a Beijing-aligned breakaway state out here in the Far East. And we see an independent Tanatuva or something. Is that something you could see on the cards if this relationship between the two does sour?
The beauty of it is the symmetry, because nibbling off a small chunk of land and then saying, come and get us and we'll nuke you. It's exactly the same kind of thing that you'd be working through when considering what might China need to do in order to achieve an objective like that. But, of course, there is still the same criterion that applies to both, that you don't to imagine that China will actually want to do this in the first place, particularly if China is contentedly sitting back and benefiting from cheap energy. The two countries do, of course, have a coincidence of strategic interest, and they do have a shared worldview. And so, to some extent, it does benefit China as much as it does Russia to be traveling in the same direction when they are challenging the West and the rules-based international order. But that doesn't stop China extracting maximum benefit from Russia along the way.
Saying that, though, the last time these guys did openly shoot at each other was over the border back in 1969, in the disputed areas around the Argun and Amur rivers. Although back then, the balance of power between these two was very, very different, with Moscow supposedly walking away from the 6 months of fighting with just 53 soldiers dead, and Beijing walking away from the 6 months of fighting with around 800 dead. Now, these days, with the Russian economy being far smaller than China's and a dramatic increase in Moscow's reliance on China for trade, how high do you think Russia would actually be able to push back on China these days?
Russia will suffer whatever terms China chooses to impose. And yes, it's definitely the case that China is in the more powerful position and is going to get more and more so in terms of how isolated Russia is, in spite of maintaining a lot of relationships that the West would rather it didn't, and how dependent it is on those few friends that are actually able to support it and tolerate what it's doing. So yes, China will be able to turn the screws still further and effectively to set its own terms.
And finally, where do you see the future of the relationship between these two going?
The extortionate discounted rates for energy are actually biting Russia already. And yes, that will continue, because as the markets for where Russia can export to shrink, those few that are willing to actually take on Russian energy are going to be extracting harsher and harsher terms. That's a process which I think is not going to go backwards. It is not just what's happening in Ukraine, but all of the other macro trends that make Russia in the long term the junior partner and much weaker. Now, certainly if Russia were able to put the Ukraine conflict to bed, they'd be able to attenuate some of their dependencies on China. And they would be able to be not quite so reliant on Chinese support in order to not only manage their defense industry, keep the war going, but also their international relationships. But there is always still going to be this underlying trend of Russia getting weaker and China still being there.
So, without a doubt, the war in Ukraine has changed the relationship between Russia and China. But whilst some changes, like the volume of weapons and materials that Russia does buy from China, have been much more covert, other changes have been far more direct and far nastier, with the balance of power very much shifting in the direction of one of the two players. But which sectors are expecting this change? How much has Ukraine altered Russia's negotiating position? And what effects will all of this have on the wider region's international trade? Well, to answer all of that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. The Pipeline Prisoner.
I think at this point, it's safe to say that Russia's locked into something of a process of vassalization, becoming a permanent junior partner, so to speak. I think for a lot of national security thinkers in Moscow, this fits something of a worst case scenario that they envisioned a decade plus ago as they were kind of fretting about China's expansive plans with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Gavin Wild is a senior fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, specializing in technology and Russian affairs. Prior to joining Carnegie, Wild served on the National Security Council as the director for Russia, Baltic, and Caucasus Affairs, as well as serving as a senior analyst for leadership roles in the National Security Agency. And prior to that, he also spent several years as a linguist for the FBI. So we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
So I think it is important to kind of put the Russia-China trade relationship in context. China makes up 26% of Russia's trade turnover, but only 3% of China's trade comes from Russia. So obviously this relationship is very, very lopsided. The growth of the trade turnover in 2023 was yes, very impressive, but it was dwarfed by the increase in trade turnover between China and Canada in 2022 by almost 3 times. And so, yes, it's impressive, but also China's got very substantial trade relationships across the globe, and Russia's is a very small slice of that pie. And so, by and large, I think it's important to remember that this is a marriage of convenience in a lot of ways that benefits Beijing a whole lot more than it's benefiting Russia at this point.
So, to start this conversation here, I want to take us back to 2022, just after Russia had launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now we just see the Nord Stream pipeline blown up and sanctions have been placed on the Russian gas markets. Now, if people remember from that time, gas prices all around the world went absolutely sky high, as Europeans began bidding with all sorts of countries to buy up any gas they could in order to replace what they'd just lost with Russia exiting the market. But despite the gas price being so high, Putin was forced to go to Xi hat in hand and beg Xi Jinping to buy up and replace the export market that Russia had just lost in Europe. Now, with Russia trying to offload a bunch of gas and the gas price sky high, both Modi of India and Xi of China would agree to buying up large chunks of the Russian oil and gas, albeit at a heavily discounted price. As with the ruble in trouble, and it being pretty obvious to everyone by that point that this little 3-day adventure may drag on for a bit longer, Moscow had little choice but to sign whatever predatory deal that China had put on the table, desperately trying to acquire foreign currency in order to stabilize their markets. Very quickly after these deals were signed, China became Russia's primary market for just about everything, with China rising from just 14% of Russian exports in 2021 all the way up to 26% of Russia's exports in 2023. And that 26% is nowhere near the total number, as we'll go through a bit later on. Now, Russia at that point would become China's overall largest source of crude oil, supplying 90% of China's overall demand, dethroning Saudi Arabia, who supplies about 15% of the Chinese market. Whilst the cameras started to focus back on Putin and he began smiling, bragging that these sanctions were absolutely useless, inside, Putin was feeling a fair bit of pain, as according to leaked documents, China was only agreeing to this deal for natural gas with Russia at an average price of $297 per 1,000 meters cubed, whereas just 2 months before, Putin had been able to charge Europe an average price of $501 per 1,000 meters cubed. So Putin was selling less volume than what he had been to Europe, and selling it to China at a 40% drop in price, which admittedly did stabilize the Russian market temporarily and inject some much needed cash into the Russian economy, but also saddled them with a deal that is far worse than what they had before. Now, Gavin, do you think Xi agreeing to buy this gas from Russia was the act of a friendly nation looking to prop up the Russian gas market? Or do you think this was more just China looking to gouge the Russians during their period of need, looking to buy out large stockpiles of oil, gas, and coal at, frankly, fire sale prices?
My sense, at least, is that it was a kind of the fire sale effect, because there's also kind of the other side of it where here's an instance where China has the benefit of a buyer's market. China's also ramping up its relationships elsewhere in the region with Turkmenistan and players in the Middle East, where they're also looking to diversify and kind of capitalize on both volumes and new trade routes. So on Russia's end, China's kind of the only game in town with regard to the very limited infrastructure, even at present, that Russia has to kind of reorient everything towards Asia. So if China drops out tomorrow, it's unclear what other constellation of purchasers Russia could have that would compensate for China's loss.
And how do the prices they were getting in the Chinese market compare to, let's say, what they were getting in the European one?
Right now, China's getting a major discount relative to everyone else. So something on the order of about 30% discount of gas compared to what Europeans are paying. And so the harsh truth for Russia is that China is a customer with a wide range of options, whether that's their own domestically produced gas, whether that's piped in or shipped from elsewhere, or frankly, shifting to renewables altogether. By comparison, Russia's range of purchasers has been whittled down to a small few, most of them in Asia and China. So there's a lot more urgency on Russia's end to try and find ways to increase volumes at a time when they don't have a lot of infrastructure to be able to do that. All the while, they're having to sell this gas and other resources at very, very steep discounts.
The other problem for Russia is frankly in its geography, as the vast majority of Russia's population and transport infrastructure sits within the European parts of Russia, whereas exporting to China requires traveling to the other side of the country. Now, there are obviously quite a number of problems to do with Russia's geography and the infrastructural problems that it brings about. As for one, Russia actually doesn't have a lot of ports, particularly ones that run all year round. And for two, particularly for natural gas, it also doesn't have a lot of seaside gas terminals. Terminals that effectively help take the gas from the pipeline, condense it down to be placed into a ship, and then that ship can then go off and transport it to another country. This being the primary method for a lot of the Middle East and places like the United States. Whereas Russia didn't build a lot of gas terminals, as why would they? When frankly, gas pipelines are a whole lot cheaper, and after all, the European market was going to be there forever. But now with the European market drastically reduced, Russia now needs to find a way to get all of that gas that was traveling down pipelines towards Europe and redirect it toward China. As if we look at Russia's three largest producing gas fields, we can quickly see where some of these problems start to emerge. So Russia's number one producer, the Bovorenkovskoye field, is almost all of its pipes built to travel from the far Arctic southwest towards Europe. If we then move to Russia's second largest gas field, Zapoyarny field, also located within the far northern Arctic fields, meaning that it too has all of its pipes heading southwest towards Europe. And I'll save you some time by letting you know that both the third and fourth largest gas fields in Russia are also based up here in the far northern Arctic, meaning that right now Russia has to pay to push that gas all the way down from the Arctic into the European part of Russia, then paying to push that gas the opposite way eastbound down a single expensive pipe from around Omsk into western China, and then all the way across China into the industrial areas of the country, just to get the gas from these fields to the Chinese market. A monumental amount of work compared to the absolute ease of simply pushing this gas into Europe. And these same sort of problems are also mirrored in the coal industry as well, as whilst China's spike in demand means that the Siberian coal mines are working overtime, and some of these China-driven mines are closer to China, most of the infrastructure around these mines is mostly based around the output levels seen before the war, and therefore, the rail infrastructure out here in the east of Siberia is frankly not always up to the task, meaning that Moscow is often put in the position where it either has to cap production of Siberian coal or make up the difference in coal by shipping in extra tonnage from the coal mines in the west of the country and then transporting them via train right across Russia, which by the time it reaches the Chinese market reportedly chews up about 2/3 of the price in transportation. What are the primary drivers of some of these problems out here?
So most of it comes down to infrastructure. There's supply chains and bottlenecks are happening because most production is located in Siberia, and then they only have so many railways and so many maritime ports through which to ship these things. It's just a lot more expensive. There's key choke points, and your volumes are capped.
So Russia's transport costs are way up, and there's extra pressure being placed on parts of its infrastructure that are the most expensive to repair. And that's when China comes in, wanting Russia to sell them the gas at an up to 40% discount. And we can quickly start to see why Russia's in the predicament they are. But obviously this is just within one sector of the country. So are these sort of price gouging deals between Russia and China just limited to the oil and gas industry, or are they also being forced onto other parts of the Russian economy as well? Is this problem quickly becoming endemic for Russia?
No, I think it's definitely the latter. I think that's going to be endemic, and Russia's going to start seeing that across a whole swath of sectors, not just these key ones. Again, their options are limited. And in a big way, as I alluded to earlier, I think the national security bureaucracy in Moscow for a long time has been a lot more wary of this kind of subservience economically. The war in Ukraine kind of forced them to cross the Rubicon. And it's my own personal sense that Putin has always kind of been a little bit more willing to accept that kind of conclusive break with the West, because he thinks it's probably just better for Russia's long-term interests, even if that means a lot more dependency on China. And the rest of the national security bureaucracy and the economic bureaucracy is now simply having to cope with that decision that's been made.
So looking at some of the motivations for a bit and why China has decided to go so hard on Russia with this one, do you think this is some sort of deep grudge that China's been holding for decades, or more of just China doing what's best for China? Which again would leave you my next question, that what if the shoe were on the other foot? That if, let's say, China was facing international sanctions for an attack on another country, and Xi was coming to Moscow desperate for natural resources, do you think Russia would also take that opportunity to really sink the boot into China, demanding similarly predatory arrangements?
There's one thing that's consistent across autocracies, it's the ability to be self-serving. Putin's not known for practicing restraint when an opportunity presents itself. And so I think there's certainly a willingness to kind of capitalize on opportunity when it exists. And so I think they would certainly act in the same way that China is. As far as economically, they're kind of locked into this arrangement for the long term, certainly from Russia's perspective. So I think that the key for a lot of decision makers is to kind of make their peace with the fact that a Russia-China soft alliance is going to be the status quo for the foreseeable future. As much as we might look at the bilateral relationship and try to read the tea leaves, I do think that the headline for the near term is a new kind of bloc forming. And Beijing may very well be the check on those reflexively revanchist instincts, certainly coming out of Moscow.
Well, on those revanchist tendencies, all of this kerfuffle was kicked off by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a conflict in which China has in public seemed to distance itself from, but in private tends to be much more involved with. So what do you think the ideal outcome in Ukraine is for China?
I think I would call it managed protraction. Beijing isn't interested in political or economic collapse in Moscow, and I think they're privately wary of the conflict getting so hot that Putin starts rattling the nuclear sabers again. But the current level of the conflict has really nothing but upsides for Beijing. Heavily discounted resources and a US and NATO unable to kind of extract themselves from focus on European security issues to dedicate more focus to the Indo-Pacific. So I don't sense that there's much urgency in Beijing for any kind of quick resolution here.
So with these sanctions being placed upon Russia, we have seen China over this period become much more wealthy, and Russia moving from arguably being a third pole between China and the US to now very quickly heading down the road of becoming a Chinese vassal state. So do you think there is a risk that by putting so much pressure on Russia at the moment, that we are in the long term simply helping out China?
I think that's certainly a case to be made. I mean, you saw just this past week a lot of diplomatic outreach from the U.S. Treasury Secretary and the Secretary of State to Beijing, pre-gaming a new round of pretty punishing sanctions and additions to the entity list to try to crimp down on the flow of Russian dual use or military use technologies into Russia. I get the sense that's going to be kind of a long-term game of whack-a-mole, particularly as it's not just a matter of direct import and export to and from Russia and China, but certainly these kind of parallel import and sanctions evasion routes going through Central Asia and Turkey and other spots. So I do think there's a risk that the West kind of looks at its sanctions regime as a panacea without understanding the very fleeting nature of a lot of these sanctions.
So by now, it's obvious that the war in Ukraine is going to have profound effects on the wider Russian economy, with the high profit markets gone and the future reliant on the high cost market that is China, making it somewhat easier to see how these long-term problems are quickly being baked into the Russian economy. But how deep will these problems go? What impact will it likely have on Russia's foreign policy? And could events on other fronts reset the balance between these two again? Well, to answer that question, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. The two-front war and the one-front store.
It is a strategic bromance, but in this bromance, Russia doesn't really have other friends. And at the same time, China has much more opportunities to have good, strong, friendly relationship with many other countries around the world.
Timur Amarov is an expert on the business, economics, and political dynamics between China, Central Asia, and Russia, as well as a fellow at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. Timur is one of the theater's most renowned experts on the relationship between these two states, having conducted years of analysis on their joint projects throughout the region, as well as previously working with the automobile manufacturer Liefen Group's CIS representative office. where he was responsible for the development of business to Central Asia and the South Caucasus. So we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
The start of Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, it was no limits friendship, and many people were describing this relationship as a sign that Russia and China are finally ready to create this alliance against the West, against the US. However, the fact that Moscow and Beijing are afraid of the word alliance, it tells us a lot about the structure of this relationship. And because of the fact that they are afraid to use alliance, they come up with different pompous and dramatic names for the relationship. No limit friendship is one of them. But interestingly, the year after the start of the invasion, when Xi Jinping came to Moscow to meet Putin, after this meeting, they also published a joint statement where there was no limits friendship already. And they were describing their relationship as a strategic relationship in the 21st century, etc., etc. A lot of pompous words, but they got rid of no limits friendships.
So right now, Russia is facing a bit of a problem, where it really has no choice but to supply China with a massive amount of gas, pumping that gas all the way from the Arctic into European Russia, before then pumping it again all the way back across Russia into China. All the while watching the costs of doing so creep up and up and up. However, there are two solutions here that we haven't yet discussed on the program. First being the Power of Siberia pipeline, number 1, a short pipeline running from the Kvita gas fields in eastern Siberia into the northern Chinese city of Heihe. But before we go into the limitations of this pipeline, you take us through how this pipeline actually came into existence.
The first Power of Siberia didn't start naturally between Russia and China. It started after Russia annexed Crimea and the West imposed the first wave of sanctions against Russia's economy. And right now, it seems that Russia is trying to find alternative to its traditional export of pipeline gas to Europe and wants to replace it with China. So that is why Moscow and Beijing are actively discussing the signing of Power of Siberia 2, which will be a pipeline that will cross through Mongolia. However, this is not something that we see quick development in. This project is still considered to be on the paper. None of the sides have started the realization of it. Moscow is still trying to get clear vision from Chinese side on what will be the terms, on who's financing what part, and China doesn't really have to speed up the process because time is on China's side here, and it is Russia who seriously needs to fill in the vacuum that was left in its gas market by Europeans. Another big project is Arctic LNG, where China is one of the stakeholders, and this project is still there. Although without access to the Western technologies, there are some questions about the future development of the project.
While the Power of Siberia 1 has been a somewhat success, the volume and outputs is still nowhere near what Russia would need to export in order to make up for the shortfall it's lost in the European market. And that's why Putin's been talking up his new project, the Power of Siberia 2, a massive gas pipeline that runs all the way from the northern Arctic fields, traveling southeast, right across some of the most remote parts of Siberia, crossing the border into Mongolia, and then directly into the heartland of China, with the pipeline having a massive capacity compared to what Power of Siberia 1 has. Meaning that if China were ever cut off from its Middle Eastern sources of gas, for any Taiwan-shaped reason, Russia could then help out by ramping up its production of gas in order to try and fill the stopgap. Now, prior to 2022, the deal between these two seemed pretty solid, with both Russia and China looking to build the project as a joint venture with Mongolia. But after Russia launched its invasion into Ukraine and the Kremlin became increasingly desperate for cash, Beijing would see an opportunity, and despite Russia consistently referring to the pipeline as the deal of a century, Beijing didn't seem to be in any sort of rush to sign the deal, and Xi would continue to push out the negotiations, saying that as each month passed by, the Russian economic position continued to hurt the economy. Xi would be able to impose even harsher terms upon Putin with a deal. with China in the meantime even going on to up its gas deals with nations like Qatar and Turkmenistan in order to signal to Russia just how little they actually needed them, and drive up the desperation within Moscow. But surely this pipeline, which would likely secure China's gas needs in the near future, would be helpful to both Russia and China. So what's actually stopping them from signing this deal?
First of all, for China, it is more logical and more effective to make short-term deals with Russia. And LNG here is a very dynamic and comfortable way of getting Russian gas because it doesn't glue you to some sort of long-term responsibilities. You have freedom of maneuver to change partners whenever you need. And when it comes to pipeline gas, and considering how unpredictable Russia is, both domestically and in foreign policy, I would also be very careful when it comes to decision making. China understands that, yes, it needs natural gas, but at the moment, it's not in the desperate need of more gas from Russia. Then it is Russia who wants to see the power of Siberia too, right here and right now. And that is why Russia becomes more and more desperate to see this pipeline in real life. So I don't see why China would want to rush things up here. And its set of importers of natural gas are pretty diverse, and it doesn't have this level of dependency on Russia that would require certain speeding up the process.
And this isn't the only industry where China is really sticking the boot into Russia at the moment. As when it comes to the coal industry, as an example, coal is absolutely booming in China at the moment, with China even putting on 2/3 of the entire world's new coal capacity last year, which by doing so, you then assume they'd turn to Russia in order to get that coal to power the stations, as Russia is a country with quite a lot of coal. But whilst China's coal imports have gone up by 43% since 2022, their purchases from Russia have only actually risen just slightly. In fact, whilst China was willing to cut Russia a break back in 2021, pausing the tariffs on Russian coal, they've now, in 2024, reintroduced those tariffs back on Russia, adding 6% for the heating coal and 3% for the steelmaking coal, which must really sting for Moscow, as whilst China's chosen to whack Russia with this out of the blue, they've also chosen to keep the tariffs paused for Indonesia and Australian coal. But the other fascinating industry at the moment is in the automotive industry, as prior to 2022, Chinese cars faced a series of barriers to get into the Russian market, encouraging Russian citizens to buy Russian cars. But now, with Western sanctions, Russia has been forced to open its doors to China, with China now making up 55% of all new automotives purchased in Russia, and 70% of all new machine parts imported into Russia, with the heads of automakers, such as the Russian car manufacturer AvtoVAZ, screaming that his company, an auto manufacturer founded back in 1966, will go bankrupt very soon if they are continued to be undercut by these new cheaper Chinese cars. So with your experience in the automotive industry, how did these Chinese automakers actually get into such a strong position here in Russia?
The situation is logical. Chinese car brands see that there is an opportunity in the Russian car market. There is a huge hole that was left by the Western companies in Russia, and it would be an easy task to fill in this gap. And that is why we see huge growth of the purchases of Chinese car brands, which was not the case even if we go like 3 years before 2024. We would have seen that Chinese brands are popular in mostly smaller cities where society doesn't have high incomes, and for them it will be a question of whether to buy a Western produced car, but an old one, or the new Chinese. But right now, people only have access to Chinese car brands that are everywhere right now in Russia. However, if we speak about long-term investment, we don't see that process happening. We don't see Chinese car brands opening new factories in Russia. They mostly see the current situation as a short-term opportunity to make money and leave, rather than they see it as an opportunity to invest in Russia and to stay there for long term.
As a side effect of a lot of these sanctions, countries in places like Central Asia have also been experiencing massive shortages in all sorts of goods and food. As for those countries, they used to get a lot of their consumer goods re-exported through Russia, meaning that if Russia's having shortages themselves, or simply can't purchase the same amount of goods for the equivalent money, that means less of these goods are making their way down into Central Asia. So with that in mind, do you think China will look to fill the gaps in the consumer markets that are currently being left wide open by the absence of Russia?
There are certain goals that China has in Central Asia, and no matter what is happening outside of Central Asia, or no matter what's happening with other Central Asian partners, China continues fulfilling its own goals and tasks in Central Asia. If we speak about Kyrgyzstan, China there cares about the domestic stability because Kyrgyzstan is known to be a very unpredictable country, and this is the country where Chinese embassy was attacked by a terrorist back in 2016. So for Kyrgyzstan, China has a specific goal to provide stability, at least around Chinese assets or investment projects or something like that. And that is why the private security companies of China are present in Kyrgyzstan, and they are not present in Uzbekistan, where the political situation is pretty much stable and the government wouldn't allow Chinese to have any sort of military or paramilitary presence in the country. So I would say those goals that China has in Central Asia, they're not tied to Russia's presence, they're not tied to Russia's influence. And one more important thing is that even before the war in Ukraine, China's trade with all 5 Central Asian countries was growing. China's access to the Central Asia was also on the rise. Most importantly, Central Asian producers would also have more access to different parts of Chinese market. However, the war in Ukraine created new opportunities for Central Asian businesses to re-export some of the products from China to Russia, because China is still cautious when it comes to secondary sanctions, and that is why it doesn't want to sometimes directly export some of the products to Russia. And here, Central Asian countries, especially those who are the part of Eurasian Economic Union, come in handy. However, I wouldn't say that China is willing to replace Russia everywhere. I don't see China running after all of the sectors where Russia can no longer provide and replacing them. It's not in Chinese interest.
Now, the largest Russian military base anywhere outside the Federation actually sits in Tajikistan, a country who also plays host to Chinese border patrol outposts. And in addition to Tajikistan, Russia also stations troops to the north in Kyrgyzstan, again, a country that has just in the last few years has seen a significant increase in the amount of Chinese PMCs operating within the country. Now add on to that the fact that a lot of the Russians based here have been stripped back and redeployed into Ukraine, leaving the garrisons here in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan at a greatly reduced strength. So with that in mind, do you see China looking to play a more militarily overt or aggressive role here in Central Asia?
There are many theories like that. If you ask people who live in Central Asian regions that share a border with the PRC, they will also have more or less same theories about the inevitable Chinese invasion. But I don't think that this is something that we would really see in the nearest future, at least under the current political leaderships in both China, Russia, and in Central Asia. I think China understands that the territory itself is not an asset anymore in the 21st century. China understands that it's more even a burden to grab more land, because with the invasion comes so many problems. What would China be doing with the people who live on that territory that do not really want to be a part of the PRC? How this whole thing will be explained to the international community. So there are so many questions and so many problems that are potentially in the air if something like this happens.
So whether it's some of these Chinese banks who are now refusing to accept ruble, or even in some cases like the Chinese investment bank, Zhejiang Kuzhao, who's now just come out to state that they will not be working with Russian exporters in the future, or even the widespread reports of Chinese investment firms now demanding bribes or discounts from Russian suppliers to even just accept Russian work and payments. All of this is having serious knock-on effects throughout the Russian economy. So what do you actually see as the end goal for Beijing here? Are they hoping to try and collapse the Russian state? Or are they simply just squeezing Moscow for everything they can?
I think that here China is being pragmatic and doesn't want a regime overthrow in Russia. China doesn't want to see newcomers that will be unpredictable, that will be unknown for Chinese leadership. They want to have same people ruling Russia as they are today, namely Vladimir Putin and his friends. Second thing that is important for China is not to be excluded from anything that is happening around Ukraine. And because of that, specifically, China participates in all of those peace talks. It has special representative, Li Hui, that is dealing with the Ukraine and participating in the negotiations, roundtables, etc. Another important priority for China when it comes to the war in Ukraine is that it wouldn't be tied to China's own confrontation with the US. China wants the US to see the war in Ukraine and its relationship with China as two separate things. And I would say that if we can imagine a future where all of those things will come together, that would be the ideal scenario for China. But I'm afraid that China isn't doing anything proactively to make this ideal future happen. I think that China is mostly adapting to the reality on the ground, because on the one hand, it's afraid to influence Moscow or put pressure on Putin somehow to move this situation to a certain direction, because it's afraid that it will bring to unpredictable consequences and the situation might get worse. I would imagine that we will see the continuation of the trends that we're observing right now. Economically, Russia will be more and more tied to the Chinese direction, and these dependency in economic terms will slowly be transferring into political dependency. And in 5 years, we might see that Russia will be ready to sacrifice some of its own distance and some of its own neutral position, and will have to agree on certain things and will have to take pro-Chinese positions in certain conflicts. For example, when it comes to the South China Sea. For now, Russia has been taking a neutral position there, not interfering and not even discussing it, ignoring it. However, in the future, Russia might go and take pro-Chinese position here because of the huge economic dependency on China. But other than that, I don't see any big changes unless something will happen either in Russia, in China, or around those two countries.
So there's an old saying that if you have 1,000 products being purchased by 1,000 customers, that gives you all the power. But if you have 1,000 products being purchased by just one customer, would give the customer all the power. After what we've just been through, I think we can see which one of these two really has the power in the relationship now. Through the sanctions placed upon Russia, Moscow is now in a position where it can no longer play a whole bunch of these European powers off of one another, enjoying wintertime bidding wars between Germany and the UK. And now instead, Russia has to either now reroute its gas through either Azerbaijan, Turkey, Bulgaria, Moldova, Austria, or even Slovakia in order to get their gas into Europe, meaning that they would have to give all of these countries a cut into their profits and pay a much higher cost in transit just to get anywhere near where they were before, which is somewhat great for all those countries, but a massive blow for Russia. But what's the alternative? As otherwise, all they can do is just keep selling more and more gas to China. a nation who is refusing to build Russia's economically boosting pipeline, a nation who's hit Russia with tariffs while letting Australia and Indonesia go free, a nation who is actively carrying out industrial takeovers without investing any long-term solutions into the industry, and a nation who demands discounts and demands from Russia, regularly holding Russian companies to frankly extortionary rates. And while, yes, it is unlikely that they would ever fully cut off Russia in response to their behavior in the same way that Europe has, and that China definitely doesn't apply any pressure on Moscow to open up democracy in Russia, but is that really worth it? You see, even in the best case scenario, where Russia were able to capitulate Ukraine today, and that they would be allowed to annex all of the land they've taken over the last 2 years of bloody fighting, even if they got all of that, would that really be worth the economic position that Russia's now been placed in? Being forced to give 40% discounts to China, and pretty much never being able to question Beijing on anything, even when they start openly pulling stunts like name changes or border questions, and trying these same little pinprick tactics that Russia has been using on its periphery for the last decades now. You see, the reality now is that the longer Beijing waits, the weaker the Russia gets. And the weaker the Russia gets, the more Beijing will be able to squeeze them for more. Whilst I'm sure there'll be endless debate online as to whether Russia or Ukraine are winning the battles in the West, I would argue that there is absolutely no doubt as to whether Moscow is losing the battle in the East. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. This has been a massive episode to try and put together, and one that's been a pain to put together as I try to get over a flu. So again, I apologize for the delay in getting this one out. But regardless of last week, I'm now back on the mend, and myself and the team can get back to all the exciting projects we have coming up for you in the next few weeks. And if you aren't aware of some of these projects we have coming up, or you want to be made aware of when we do drop our next episode, you can find all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliotOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Joe No So Slow, Matthew Sarin, Robert Miner, Mike Fish, Laurie Halila, Vingtang Weng, Jacob Kelly, and Carl Soizeth. And we cannot thank them enough for their donations. So if you feel you could spare a couple of dollars and you want special access to our upcoming Patreon events and workshops, or recordings of our recent events with full presentations unpacking complicated issues like Russia's modern day invasion plans for war with NATO in 2024, you can sign up to our Patreon group today via the link in the description. But for now, this episode on the Russia-China relationship is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Russia's War on Everybody by this week's guest, Kia Giles, for a fantastic look at what's driving Russia's thinking and how the country functions. The second is Putinomics by Albrecht Rothacher, for a look at how the current regime has shaped the modern Russian economy. And the third is Economic War by friend of the show, Maximilian Hess, for a look at sanctions and how the sanctions evasions are impacting Russia. I want to thank this week's guests, Kia Giles, Gavin Wild, and Timur Amarov. All of you were absolutely fantastic on this one, and we can't thank you enough for your amazing work. I also want to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers of this piece, that being Kia Bilk, Genevieve Donlan-May, Nate Ostiller, Ben Nutter, and Jamie Tanu. This was a pretty huge episode to try and pull together, so I can't thank them all enough for this one. I'd also like to thank the rest of my team, being Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Daniela Givella, Nate Ostiller, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donlan-May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz von Kierbilk, Mason Wise, Andrew Gundell, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbery, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Sean Cotter-Lem. Our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tano, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Woolgarten from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. I know I say it almost every week, but it is the absolute best research team in the business. Which brings me to my last point, which is that the Red Line will be back in a fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.